On the morning of February the 20th, 2026, 9 justices in Washington handed down a ruling that undid the single largest tax policy experiment of Donald Trump's second term. By a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court declared that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law Trump had used to justify sweeping tariffs on nearly every country trading with the United States, never actually gave a president the power to impose tariffs at all. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion. Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Brett Kavanaugh dissented. And just like that, the legal foundation underneath one of the most aggressive trade policies in modern American history cracked wide open. But here's what makes this story matter to every single person reading a grocery receipt or a car dealership invoice right now. The ruling didn't end the tariffs. It didn't lower a single price at the checkout counter. In many ways, it simply forced the fight into its next messier phase, one that is still playing out in courtrooms and trading floors as you watch this. To understand how the country got here, you have to go back to the first weeks of Trump's second term. On February 1st, 2025, President Trump invoked IEEPA to declare a national emergency over illicit drug trafficking, using that declaration to slap tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. Then, on April 2nd, 2025, a date the administration branded Liberation Day, Trump expanded the policy dramatically, rolling out tariffs across almost every trading partner the United States has. Depending on the country and the product, the rates climbed as high as 20, 25, even 60%. From that point forward, the policy became a moving target. According to the Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan tax policy research group, tariff rates changed more than 50 times between the start of 2025 and the middle of 2026. Businesses trying to plan a year of imports had almost no way to know what the rules would look like by the time their shipping containers cleared customs. Here's the first thing worth understanding clearly, because it gets confused constantly in political debate. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. Tariffs are a tax collected at the border, and the importer of record, whoever legally brings the goods into the country, is the one who pays it. President Trump has repeatedly said other nations are footing the bill, but according to a February 2026 analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, American consumers and companies were absorbing close to 90% of the added tariff costs. That is not a partisan talking point. That is a Federal Reserve calculation. So when you hear that tariffs raised billions of dollars for the U.S. Treasury, remember where that money actually came from. It came out of the same supply chains that stock grocery shelves, fill car lots, and load container ships at ports like Los Angeles. Now let's talk about what the Supreme Court actually decided, because the details matter more than the headline. The case was called Learning Resources, Inkausser versus Trump, combined with a related case, Trump versus VI, OS Selections, Inc. The question in front of the justices was simple on its face. Does IEEPA, a law originally designed to let a president freeze assets or block transactions during a genuine national security emergency, also let that same president impose broad, open-ended taxes on imported goods? The court said no. According to the Congressional Research Service, which published a legal summary of the decision, the justices affirmed a lower court ruling that had already invalidated 2 major sets of IEEPA tariffs, the ones tied to the declared emergencies over drug trafficking from Canada, Mexico, and China. As a direct result of that ruling, the Trump administration issued an executive order terminating all IEEPA-based tariffs at midnight Eastern Time on February 24th, 2026, according to the law firm White & Case, which tracks trade policy for corporate clients. For a few days in late February, it looked like a significant chunk of the tariff regime that had reshaped global trade for over a year was simply gone. Except it wasn't gone, it just moved. 4 days after the ruling, during his State of the Union address, President Trump did not back down. He called the decision very unfortunate and told Congress that countries which had, in his words, been ripping us off for decades were now paying the United States hundreds of billions of dollars. He vowed to keep fighting for his trade agenda through other legal channels. And that promise turned out to be exactly what happened next. Here's where the story gets complicated and where you need to pay close attention, because this is the part most casual coverage skips entirely. Losing the IEEPA authority didn't mean the administration ran out of options. Trade law in the United States includes several other statutes a president can lean on, each with its own rules and its own limits. According to Brookings Institution scholars who analyzed the ruling, Trump had already been using one of those alternatives even before the Supreme Court acted. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which allowed him to impose a flat 10% global tariff, later raised to 15%. But Section 122 comes with a built-in expiration clock. Under the statute, those tariffs automatically lapse after 150 days unless Congress votes to extend them. That clock ran out on July 24th, 2026. And this is where the timeline gets almost too tidy to be a coincidence. According to the National Association of Manufacturers, which tracks trade policy on behalf of American industry, the Office of the United States Trade Representative pre-published a new set of tariffs under yet another legal authority, Section 301 of the Trade Act, on July 23, 2026. That's one day, a single day, before the Section 122 tariffs were set to expire. The new Section 301 tariffs covered roughly 60 trading partners and applied rates of 10 to 12.5% on goods, representing, according to the states that later sued over this, 99.4% of all U.S. imports. In plain terms, as one legal doorway to broad tariffs closed, the administration had already walked through another one, timed almost to the hour. That timing did not go unnoticed. On August 3, 2026, a coalition of 25 Democratic-led states filed a lawsuit in the U.S. Court of International Trade, according to CNBC's reporting. Their argument wasn't just that the new tariffs were bad policy. Their argument was that the Section 301 process had been used as a workaround, a way to reinstate tariffs the Supreme Court and lower courts had already rejected, without going through the more rigorous investigative process Section 301 normally requires. The lawsuit cited public comments from administration officials as evidence the outcome had been decided in advance. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer had said after the Supreme Court ruling that his office would use alternative trade authorities on an accelerated schedule to, in his phrase, ensure continuity. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent reportedly said tariff rates would return to exactly where they were. Those are the kinds of statements that end up as evidence in a courtroom. It's worth pausing here to be honest about what remains unresolved. As of this recording, that lawsuit is still working its way through the courts. Nobody, not the administration, not the 25 states, not independent trade analysts, can tell you with certainty how a court will ultimately rule on whether Section 301 was used properly. This is a live legal fight, not a settled fact, and any script that tells you otherwise is getting ahead of the record. So what does all of this legal back and forth actually mean for the price of a gallon of milk or a used sedan? Let's get into the numbers because they tell a story of their own. According to the Tax Foundation's ongoing tariff tracker, updated as recently as this month, the new tariffs apply to about 54% of all U.S. goods imports in 2026. The organization estimates the applied tariff rate, the rate businesses actually face at the border before accounting for behavioral shifts, has climbed to 11.7%, up from just 1.5% back in 2022. Factor in how businesses adjust their purchasing to dodge some of the higher costs, and the Tax Foundation estimates the effective tariff rate for 2026 will land around 7.2%. That may not sound dramatic until you hear the comparison the researchers offer themselves. It would be the highest average tariff rate the United States has recorded since 1969. The Tax Foundation isn't alone in these estimates, and the range across different research groups is itself instructive. The organization's own household burden estimate for 2026 sits at roughly $840 per household. The Tax Policy Center, a separate research group, puts the number closer to $920 per household. The Yale Budget Lab, in an April 2026 analysis, estimated a household burden between $760 and $940, depending on whether a related tariff provision expires as scheduled or gets extended. None of these are identical numbers, and that's an important detail in itself. Reasonable, well-resourced economic teams looking at the same tariff regime are landing in a range, not at a single precise figure, which tells you the uncertainty here is real, not just political spin from one side or the other. What all three estimates agree on is the shape of who bears the burden. According to the Tax Foundation's distributional analysis, tariffs hit lower-income households harder as a share of what they earn, even when the raw dollar amount is smaller. The Foundation estimates that in 2026, tax filers in the bottom income quintile will see about a $74 decline in after-tax income due to tariffs, compared with roughly $1,907 for filers in the top quintile. That sounds like the wealthy are paying more, and in dollar terms they are. But measured as a percentage of income, the burden flips. The bottom quintile absorbs a decline of about 0.7% of after-tax income, while the very top 1% of earners see a smaller percentage hit, somewhere around 0.5 to 0.6%. In other words, this tax falls disproportionately in relative terms on people with the least room in their budget to absorb it. Now, here's a genuine turn in this story, something that complicates the simple narrative of tariffs equal instant price spikes. According to CNN's ongoing tracker of the tariff rollout, consumers had not, for most of the past year, seen the dramatic price increases many economists warned about back when Liberation Day was first announced. Prices moved up, but more gradually than some of the earliest. Alarming predictions suggested. Part of the explanation, according to Federal Reserve research published in the spring of 2026, is timing. The Fed's own researchers found that the full effect of a tariff increase can take roughly 7 months to fully show up in consumer prices, because companies initially try to preserve their profit margins rather than immediately passing costs on. Eventually, though, the research found companies do pass those costs through. Every extra dollar a business pays to import a good tends to eventually land on the customer's receipt. That slow burn is exactly why the timing of this story matters so much right now. The Section 301 tariffs only went into effect in late July 2026. If the Fed's 7-month pass-through window holds, the real price impact of this latest round of tariffs may not be fully visible in the data until sometime in early 2027, well after most casual news coverage will have moved on to the next headline. There's another complicating factor sitting on top of all this, and it has nothing to do with tariff law at all. According to CNN's reporting, the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war involving Iran has been pushing up transportation and shipping costs independently of any tariff policy. That matters because it shrinks the financial cushion American businesses have to absorb tariff costs without passing them on to shoppers. When a company is already paying more to move freight because of geopolitical instability overseas, it has far less room to eat a new tariff bill quietly. Two separate pressures, one from trade law in Washington, one from a war zone thousands of miles away, are compounding on each other inside the same supply chains that stock American shelves. Let's talk about what the inflation data actually shows, because this is where political spin and verified numbers tend to diverge the most sharply. According to a fact check based on Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index data, grocery prices rose 0.3% from August to September, following a 0.6% jump the month before, which was the largest single month-to-month increase in 3 years at that point. Year over year, average grocery prices were up about 2.7% and about 1.4% higher than they had been in January, the month Trump returned to office. The increases were broad, touching most of the major grocery categories tracked by the government. Coffee prices, specifically, were up 18.9% year over year. Beef and veal were up 14.7%. This data directly contradicted public claims from President Trump that grocery prices were down or way down. The numbers, straight from the government's own statistical agency, showed the opposite. That is not analysis or spin. That is simply what the Consumer Price Index recorded. More recent research adds a layer of nuance to this. According to an analysis published by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in August 2026, the inflationary contribution, specifically attributable to tariffs, appeared to stabilize starting around March 2026, with other economic factors becoming the larger driver of remaining excess inflation. But there's a crucial caveat. The St. Louis Fed researchers themselves flagged. Their analysis was completed before the Section 301 tariffs took effect on July 23rd. That means the freshest, broadest new round of tariffs in this entire saga simply isn't reflected yet in the most recent Fed inflation research available. We genuinely don't know yet how much of an additional bump those tariffs will add because the data hasn't caught up to the policy. Let's widen the lens for a moment to public opinion, because how Americans feel about this policy is its own kind of data point. According to a Harrison Guardian poll conducted in March 2026, 64% of Republicans, 77% of Democrats, and 67% of independents said they believed tariffs had raised the prices of goods they personally buy. Even among Republicans, 60% said tariffs had done more harm than good for consumers overall, a number that climbed to 81% among Democrats and 75% among independents. A separate YouGov poll, reported the same week, found that 46% of respondents said the administration's tariffs had increased prices a lot. When a policy this specific and this technical is producing bipartisan agreement on its downside from voters who agree on almost nothing else politically in 2026, that itself is a striking data point worth sitting with. Now, back to the money that's already been collected, because there's a financial subplot here that rarely makes the headlines. When the Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariffs, it didn't just stop future collection, it opened the door for businesses to seek refunds on the tariffs they'd already paid under that now invalidated authority. The court itself, according to White and Case's legal summary, remanded the specific question of how to handle those refunds back down to the lower courts, rather than settling it directly. According to a local news report from KTTC published in August 2026, roughly 6 months after the ruling, the U.S. Court of International Trade recorded that the administration had refunded about $100 billion, which the filing described as around 60% of the total amount owed to businesses. That leaves a meaningful chunk of money, tens of billions of dollars, still sitting in limbo between the federal government and the American companies waiting to get it back. It's important to note here that not every tariff from this era got wiped out by the Supreme Court ruling. Tariffs imposed under different legal authorities, some dating back to Trump's first term in 2018, remained in place regardless of the IEEPA decision. According to the Tax Policy Center's tracker, the administration concluded a Section 232 investigation into polysilicon, a material used in semiconductors and solar panels, on August 6, 2026, imposing a 15% tariff along with minimum import price rules. On July 31, 2026, the administration also announced a new Section 201 tariff specifically targeting quartz surface products. These are narrower, more targeted tariffs than the sweeping IEEPA measures, but they're real. They're currently active, and they add to the overall cost pressure facing importers. There's one more overlooked piece of this puzzle worth mentioning: the de minimis exemption. Back on August 29, 2025, the administration suspended an old customs rule that had allowed shipments valued at $800 or less to enter the country duty-free. According to White & Case's tracking of the policy, that suspension applied IEEPA tariffs, along with every other applicable tariff, to low-value shipments, the kind of small parcels that power a huge share of direct-to-consumer online shopping. Even as the broader IEEPA tariffs were later struck down, the administration worked to preserve that de minimis suspension through other legal authorities, meaning the era of duty-free small packages from overseas sellers has, for practical purposes, ended. Zoom out even further, and the ripple effects reach markets you might not expect. According to a report from the crypto news outlet Cryptonomist published in August 2026, financial markets have been reacting to tariff-driven inflation expectations in ways that extend into cryptocurrency. Persistent inflation concerns tend to push up treasury yields, which in turn make government bonds more attractive relative to non-yielding assets like Bitcoin, pulling investment away from speculative markets. During one earlier tariff-related scare, spot Bitcoin exchange-traded funds recorded roughly $235 million in net outflows, affecting products from major firms including Fidelity, Grayscale, Bitwise, and ARK Invest. Even hardware manufacturers tied to cryptocurrency mining, companies like Bitmain, Canaan, and MicroBT, reportedly began shifting parts of their production toward the United States as the trade tensions escalated, an example of how tariff policy reaches into corners of the economy that seem, on the surface, completely unrelated to grocery prices or car dealerships. Let's also be fair to the bigger macroeconomic picture the administration points to. According to the Tax Foundation's modeling, the tariffs currently imposed and scheduled are projected to raise about $1.5 trillion for the federal government between 2026 and 2035. The Tax Policy Center separately estimates about $1.7 trillion in revenue over roughly the same period, with around $177 billion collected in 2026 alone. That is genuinely significant federal revenue, and it's the number the administration highlights most often when defending the policy. President Trump, in his State of the Union remarks, framed this revenue as proof the tariffs were working, describing it as taking a financial burden off the people he said he loves, and arguing the money represented other countries finally paying their fair share. But the same Tax Foundation model that produces that revenue estimate also projects the tariffs will reduce long-run U.S. gross domestic product by about 0.4%, shrink the national capital stock by roughly 0.3%, and cost the economy approximately 345,000 full-time equivalent jobs over the long run. The mechanism, according to the Foundation's economists, works like this. Tariffs create a wedge between the price a consumer pays and the price a producer actually receives for their goods, which, over time, reduces the return on labor. Lower returns to labor tend to mean fewer hours worked, and when overall economic output falls, the return on capital investment falls with it, which discourages further investment. It's a chain reaction, not an isolated cost, and it's the same government revenue number cited as a success story by supporters that critics point to as evidence of a slow economic drag. There's a political dimension layered on top of all of this that's worth mentioning, honestly, because it shapes what happens next. According to Brookings Institution analysts, the Section 122 tariffs required congressional reauthorization to continue beyond their 150-day window, and that timing landed just months before the 2026 midterm elections. That means members of Congress may be asked to cast public, on-the-record votes about extending broad tariff authority right as they're campaigning for re-election, a scenario several legal scholars described as forcing a level of democratic accountability that the original IEEPA workaround had allowed the administration to avoid entirely. So where does that leave things as of today? The honest answer is unresolved and actively contested in at least 2 different courtrooms. The Section 301 tariffs implemented in late July remain in effect, while the 25 state lawsuit works through the U.S. Court of International Trade. Refund payments from the invalidated IEEPA tariffs continue rolling out gradually, with roughly 40% of the owed amount still unpaid as of the most recent public accounting. And the full inflationary impact of the newest tariffs likely hasn't even shown up in consumer prices yet, based on the Federal Reserve's own research on how long that pass-through typically takes. Before we wrap up, let's be transparent about where every number in this script actually came from, because that transparency is the whole point of doing this seriously. The Supreme Court ruling details came from the official opinion in Learning Resources, in Cares versus Trump, along with a Congressional Research Service legal summary and reporting from the law firm White & Case. Household cost estimates came from the Tax Foundation, the Tax Policy Center, and the Yale Budget Lab, three separate research organizations whose numbers differ slightly, which is itself worth noting rather than smoothing over. Consumer price data came directly from Bureau of Labor Statistics figures cited in fact-checking reporting. Polling data came from a Harris and Guardian survey and a separate YouGov poll. Federal Reserve research came from both the New York Fed and the St. Louis Fed. Legal and legislative context came from Brookings Institution scholars, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and the National Association of Manufacturers. The lawsuit details came from CNBC's reporting. Refund progress came from a local news report by KTTC, and the broader financial market ripple effects came from cryptonomists' coverage of crypto market reactions. What remains genuinely unverified or still in dispute, and should be treated that way, includes the ultimate legal outcome of the 25-state lawsuit, the precise final household cost figure once all the competing economic models are reconciled, and how much of the newest Section 301 tariffs will actually show up in prices once enough time has passed for the Federal Reserve's own 7-month pass-through window to play out. Let's rewind for a moment and look at a detail that gets lost in the day-to-day churn of tariff headlines: how unusual it was for a president to invoke IEEPA for tariffs at all. According to the Congressional Research Service, no president before Trump's second term had ever used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as legal justification for imposing tariffs. The law had traditionally been used for things like freezing the assets of hostile foreign governments or blocking financial transactions tied to sanctioned individuals, not for taxing imported goods. That's part of why the Supreme Court case felt so consequential to trade lawyers watching it closely. It wasn't just a dispute over one specific tariff rate. It was a test of whether a president could use emergency powers, designed for genuine national security crises, to reshape ordinary commercial tax policy without ever going back to Congress for a vote. That question of institutional power shows up again in one of the more pointed parts of the Brookings Institution's analysis of the ruling. Their scholars noted that the Constitution places the power to tax squarely with the legislative branch, not the executive. The Supreme Court's ruling, in their reading, wasn't simply a technical statutory interpretation question. It was, as one Brookings contributor put it, a reinforcement of a basic constitutional boundary about who in Washington actually gets to decide how much Americans pay in taxes on the goods they buy. It's also worth understanding the additional layers of tariffs that existed even before the IEEPA fight reached the Supreme Court, because the picture was never just one flat global rate. According to White and Case's tracking of the policy, the administration had layered on a 25% additional IEEPA tariff, specifically targeting imports from India, tied to India's continued purchases of Russian oil, an arrangement that ran from August 2025 through early February 2026. The administration issued similar executive orders creating frameworks for so-called secondary tariffs aimed at countries doing business with Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, though according to that same tracking, no tariffs were actually collected under most of those specific frameworks by the time the Supreme Court ruled. That distinction matters. Not every tariff threat the administration announced over the past year and a half actually turned into a collected tax. Some existed mostly as leverage in broader negotiations, never fully activated. The Tax Foundation's tracker also details how the administration adjusted tariffs on specific industrial materials throughout 2026, on top of the broader country-by-country rates. Steel, aluminum, and copper tariffs, imposed under Section 232 National Security Authority, were updated in June 2026, according to the Foundation's research notes, layering additional cost onto industries from construction to automobile manufacturing. A separate Section 338 tariff targeting Canada was added around the same time. None of these narrower, material-specific tariffs depended on the IEEPA authority the Supreme Court struck down, which is exactly why they survived the ruling untouched while the broader global tariffs did not. It's worth stepping back to compare this moment to earlier tariff history, because context changes how extreme a number like 11.7% actually sounds. According to the Tax Foundation's own long-run historical comparison, the last time the United States ran an average tariff rate anywhere near what's being discussed for 2026 was 1969, more than half a century ago. Go back further, and the closest genuine precedent for a trade policy shift this large is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, a piece of Depression-era legislation that economic historians have studied for decades as a cautionary tale about how aggressive tariff increases can deepen an economic downturn by triggering retaliation from trading partners and shrinking global trade volumes. Nobody serious is claiming the current situation is a repeat of the Great Depression, but the scale of the rate increase from 1.5% in 2022 to something approaching double digits in 2026 is genuinely without a peacetime precedent in most of our lifetimes, according to the Foundation's own historical framing. There's also an underappreciated behavioral piece to this story that the Reason Foundation's analysis, drawing on tax foundation modeling, spells out clearly. The effective tariff rate businesses actually pay isn't simply the announced rate multiplied by import volume. It's lower than that, because companies change their purchasing behavior once tariffs raise costs. According to that analysis, the effective rate would have been even higher than current estimates, as much as 15.52% back in October of last year, except that businesses substitute cheaper alternative suppliers or products once the tariffed option becomes too expensive. That substitution effect softens the blow somewhat, but the same research is careful to note it doesn't erase the burden. It just redistributes some of it, sometimes toward lower quality or less preferred substitute goods, rather than the products consumers originally wanted to buy. JP Morgan's global research team offered one more useful data point from before the Supreme Court ruling that helps explain the sheer scale of what was at stake. According to senior global economist Nora Centovani, IEEPA-related tariff measures accounted for roughly 61% of the total year-to-date increase in U.S. tariffs as of last October, representing about $180 billion on an annualized basis. That's the scale of the tariff regime the Supreme Court effectively invalidated in one ruling, which helps explain why the administration moved so quickly, within days, to find alternative legal authorities to preserve as much of that revenue and trade leverage as possible. None of this happens in a vacuum separate from ordinary household budgets, and it's worth being specific about where the pressure actually lands. According to reporting that surveyed supply chain experts, tariffs don't just make foreign-made finished products more expensive, they raise costs throughout entire supply chains, because many products Americans think of as domestically made still rely on imported raw materials or components somewhere in the manufacturing process. A car assembled in an American factory might still contain imported steel, electronics, or specialty parts subject to these tariffs, meaning the sticker price on a supposedly all-American vehicle can rise right alongside the price of something imported directly from overseas. That's part of why the price pressure from this policy shows up almost everywhere at once, from the grocery aisle to the car lot to the electronics store, rather than staying confined to obviously imported goods. If you've made it this far, you've now seen more of the actual paper trail behind this story than most 5-minute headline summaries ever bother to show you. And that kind of depth is exactly what you'll keep getting here every time a story like this develops. So if that's useful to you, sticking around for the next update is worth doing. There's more coming on how the state lawsuit plays out in the Court of International Trade, and on whether Congress actually holds that midterm season vote on extending tariff authority, and those follow-ups will matter just as much as everything covered today. When policy moves this fast, across this many separate legal fights at once, missing the next update means missing the part of the story where it actually gets resolved. One last thread worth pulling on before we close. What happens to the 25-state lawsuit now sitting in the Court of International Trade will likely set the tone for how this entire saga resolves. According to CNBC's reporting, the trade court had already rejected the administration's use of Section 122 once before, though that specific ruling was paused pending an appeal, meaning even the legal ground the administration stood on temporarily has been challenged more than once. If the court eventually finds that Section 301 was used improperly as a workaround, rather than a genuine independently justified trade action, the administration could face the same scenario it just went through with IEEPA. Another round of refunds, another scramble for a new legal authority, and another cycle of uncertainty for every importer trying to plan next year's inventory. If the court upholds the Section 301 approach instead, it would effectively validate the administration's strategy of using narrower, more procedurally defensible statutes to rebuild a broad tariff regime after losing the sweeping IEEPA authority, a precedent that could shape how future presidents of either party approach trade policy for years to come. So here's the honest question. This whole story leaves open, and it's one worth thinking about rather than reacting to instantly. When a policy this legally contested, this economically debated, and this expensive for ordinary households keeps surviving one court defeat after another by shifting to a new legal authority, is that resilience a sign the policy has real economic merit worth defending in court? Or is it a sign that the normal checks meant to slow down a costly contested tax increase simply aren't working the way they're supposed to? Where do you land on that? And what do you think happens once the current lawsuit reaches a final ruling? Drop your take in the comments, because on a story this contested, hearing where you actually land matters more than any conclusion this script could hand you. That's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next update as the story keeps moving.